had spent months planning my solo hike through the Amazon rainforest. It was something I had dreamed of for years, the chance to push myself, to see the raw, untamed wilds of the world's largest jungle. I had read everything I could, studied the maps, prepared my gear meticulously. I knew the dangers: jaguars, venomous snakes, insects that could kill a man in hours, the unforgiving terrain. But nothing could have truly prepared me for what I was about to experience. I arrived in a small town near the Brazilian border, the last real sign of civilization before I would step into the green abyss. The air was thick and heavy, the scent of wet earth and rotting vegetation filling my nose. I made last-minute checks, ensuring I had everything: a machete, a compass, a GPS, purification tablets, enough food for 2 weeks, and a lightweight tent. I had trained for this, and I felt confident. That confidence would not last. The first day was manageable. The jungle was a living, breathing thing, filled with noises that never stopped. The chirping of unseen birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant cries of howler monkeys. I moved carefully, cutting through thick vines, stepping over tangled roots, always mindful of where I placed my feet. A wrong step could mean a twisted ankle or worse. The heat was overwhelming, sweat soaking through my clothes within minutes, but I pushed forward. By the third day, I was deep into the rainforest, the sounds of the town nothing more than a memory. The canopy was so thick that daylight barely reached the forest floor, and the humidity was suffocating. My clothes clung to me like a second skin, my backpack feeling heavier with each passing hour. But I pressed on, following my map and compass, making good time. I camped near a slow-moving river, filtering water before cooking a simple meal of rice and dried meat. It was that night that I first had the feeling, a sensation that I was not alone. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The jungle was full of life. Of course, things were moving around me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I barely slept, my hand resting on my machete, ears straining against the darkness. The next day, I pushed forward, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I reminded myself of the plan: keep moving, stick to the route, and trust my training. But the deeper I went, the worse the feeling became. I was being watched. I was sure of it now. The jungle had eyes, and they were on me. Tracks in the mud. Not animal tracks. Human. Barefoot. I stopped cold, staring at the imprint in the soft earth. It wasn't just one set. There were multiple. Some fresh, some older. My skin prickled. I had read about uncontacted tribes, about illegal loggers, about dangers beyond the wildlife. I had hoped to avoid them. Now, it seemed I wasn't alone after all. I quickened my pace, determined to put as much distance between myself and whoever had left those tracks. The jungle closed in tighter around me, the air thick with tension. Every sound made me jump. A snapping branch, a rustling leaf. My heart pounded. I kept moving. By the 6th day, I was exhausted. I hadn't seen anyone, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. Food was running lower than I expected, my appetite gone from the stress. My GPS was acting strangely, glitching, but I still had my map and compass. I was sure I was on track, but something was wrong. That night, as I set up camp, I found another footprint. This one was different. It was closer, too close to where I had slept the night before. Someone had been watching me. My stomach twisted. I didn't light a fire that night. I stayed awake, gripping my machete, straining to hear beyond the endless drone of insects. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just before dawn, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't the sound of the jungle. It wasn't the call of an animal. It was low, deliberate, human. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The whispering stopped, but I knew someone, or something, was out there. I waited until the first light crept through the trees before I dared to move. I packed in minutes, abandoning anything that wasn't essential. I needed to get out. I moved faster than I had before, my muscles burning, my mind racing. The jungle seemed to close in around me, each shadow a threat, each movement in the brush a warning. I didn't stop to eat, barely stopped to drink. I just kept moving. By midday, I realized I was off course. My compass didn't match my map. Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. I needed to stay calm. I adjusted my course and pressed on, hoping to reach a river that would lead me to safety. But the feeling of being followed never left me. The whispering returned that night, closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't words, but it was human. I knew it. I sat in the darkness, clutching my machete, pulse hammering in my ears. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't care about the noise. I didn't care about exhaustion. I ran through the jungle, tearing through vines, stumbling over roots, my breath ragged. The footsteps followed. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My mind screamed at me to keep moving. By some miracle, I reached the river. The current was strong, but I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the water, letting it carry me downstream. I half swam, half drifted for what felt like hours. When I finally pulled myself onto the muddy bank, I collapsed, gasping for air. The jungle was silent. I didn't know if I had escaped, but I didn't stop. I forced myself up and kept moving along the river. The fear never left me, but I pushed forward, step by step. 2 days later, I stumbled into a logging camp, barely able to speak. They helped me, fed me, listened as I tried to explain. They didn't look surprised. They told me I was lucky. There were things in the jungle, they said. Not animals, not spirits, people. People who didn't want to be found. People who watched. People who waited. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know more. I just wanted to leave. When I finally boarded a plane back home, I looked down at the endless green expanse below. I had survived, but the Amazon had changed me. The jungle wasn't just trees and rivers. It was something else entirely, and I would never go back. I was never the type to go hiking alone, but sometimes you make decisions that don't seem wrong until you're too deep in them to turn back. It was early fall when I set out, the kind of season where the air is crisp but not too cold. The leaves are turning, and the woods feel alive in a way that makes you forget how quiet they really are. I had taken time off work and decided to challenge myself with a longer trail, one that went deep into the mountains and had fewer people. I packed well: food, water, a solid knife, and a good map. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I knew enough to be careful. The trail I picked was supposed to be a 3-day loop through thick forest and steep ridges. Nothing too extreme, but isolated enough that I wouldn't run into many other people. That was the appeal. The first day was uneventful. I moved through the trails, feeling good, setting up camp before sundown. I ate, listened to the sounds of the forest, and slept fine. The second day, things started to feel different. It wasn't anything I could put into words at first, just small things. The silence lasted longer between the usual bird calls. The wind moved through the trees in a way that didn't quite feel right. It wasn't enough to make me stop, just enough to sit in the back of my head. I pressed on, reaching a ridge that overlooked miles of dense woods below. My map showed a small creek about a mile ahead, a good spot to refill my water. I followed the trail down, the trees pressing in tighter the deeper I went. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and decaying leaves. I kept moving, but something felt off. I wasn't sure what at first. Then I noticed the flies. They weren't the normal kind, the ones that hovered around damp spots or your food. These were thick, slow-moving, clustering in the air in a way that made my skin crawl. I swatted at them and kept walking, telling myself it was just something dead. A small animal, maybe a deer. The forest takes care of its own. But the smell hit next. It was worse than anything I'd ever smelled before. Thick, rotting sour. It filled my nose, clung to the back of my throat. I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it barely helped. My first instinct was to turn back. I should have. But something about the smell, the way it seemed to drift in one direction, made me want to know what it was. I stepped off the trail, moving slowly, pushing through the underbrush. The flies thickened. The smell got worse. Then I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was just a shape, something dark against the forest floor. Then the details came into focus. A body. It wasn't fresh. The skin was gray, bloated. Parts of it had been eaten, animals had gotten to it. The face was half gone. The mouth locked open in a way that made my stomach turn. The arms were stretched out, fingers curled into the dirt like the person had been clawing at the ground before they died. I stepped back, my foot catching on a root, my balance shifting. I managed to stay upright, but my body was screaming at me to move. This wasn't an accident. The body wasn't lying in a way that suggested a fall. It looked placed, stretched out, arranged. I wanted to believe it was just someone who got lost and didn't make it. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The body had no shoes. The feet were bare, dirty, scratched up. But a few feet away, near the base of a tree, were a pair of boots, perfectly placed side by side, as if someone had taken them off and set them down neatly. Something about that detail made my hands shake. I took a step back, then another. My body was telling me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet, to move carefully. I turned, heading back toward the trail, my breath coming fast. The woods were too quiet. The usual rustling of animals, the distant sound of birds. It was all gone. Felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I walked faster. My pack felt heavier. My skin was crawling. I reached the trail, but I didn't stop. I didn't check my map, didn't think. I just moved. Fast. I wanted distance between me and that body. I didn't know what happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to find it. I pushed forward for hours, my legs burning, my heart pounding. I needed to get to a safer spot, somewhere further from whatever I had just walked into. As the sun started to dip, I found a small clearing and forced myself to stop. I needed to rest, to think. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking as I worked. I ate without tasting the food. Every noise in the woods made me jump. Then, just as the last light faded, I heard something. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the rustling of a deer moving through the brush. These were slow, deliberate steps. I stopped breathing. The sound was coming from the direction I had just come from. Then they stopped. I sat there, frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. Minutes passed. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, my knife in my hand, my ears straining for any sound. When morning came, I packed up and left without hesitation. I didn't bother finishing the loop. I went the fastest way back to the nearest trailhead, barely stopping for water. By the time I reached my car, my body was exhausted, my mind numb. I didn't call the police. I should have. But something in me told me that whatever I had stumbled onto, it was bigger than just a lost hiker. I left and never hiked that trail again. Weeks later, I checked the news. Nothing. No missing person reports, no bodies found. It was like it never happened. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone out there. It was a simple idea. A weekend hiking trip, me, my wife, and her stepbrother. Nothing complicated, just fresh air, long trails, and a break from the usual routine. We had done hikes before, but this was the first time all three of us were going together. My wife had suggested it, thinking it would be good for us to spend more time with her stepbrother. He had been going through a rough patch lately, something about work stress and needing to clear his head. We planned a 2-day hike deep in the wilderness, a place far from any town, the kind of place where you wouldn't get cell service, and the nearest help would be miles away. We packed light but smart food, water, first aid, a GPS, and a couple of knives just in case. My wife was always good at preparing for things, making sure we had everything we needed. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 4 hours. The last part of the trip was on a dirt road, winding through thick trees. It felt like we were leaving the world behind, going somewhere untouched. When we finally arrived, there were no other cars in the small parking area. Just us. That was fine. We wanted solitude. We set off in the late morning, the sun bright overhead. The trail started off easy, winding through thick pines and rocky paths. Birds chirped in the distance, and every now and then, we'd hear the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. The air smelled fresh, clean, untouched by city pollution. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The trail had some steep sections, but nothing too difficult. We took breaks when needed, drinking water and eating small snacks to keep up our energy. My wife led most of the way, with her stepbrother behind her and me taking up the rear. It was quiet except for the sounds of nature around us. As the day wore on, the forest grew denser. The trees towered above us, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt cooler, damp. The trail became narrower, less maintained. It was clear that not many people came this way. At one point, we noticed an old sign nailed to a tree. The writing was faded, almost unreadable. What little we could make out warned about unmarked areas ahead. It didn't say much else. My wife hesitated for a moment, but her stepbrother brushed it off. We had a GPS, a map. We weren't worried. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing where we decided to set up camp. The area was flat, surrounded by trees, and had enough space for our tents. We gathered some wood for a small fire, just enough to keep warm and cook some food. It felt peaceful, being out there in the quiet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The sounds of birds were replaced by the occasional rustling in the bushes, the distant call of an animal we couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, almost too still. We sat around the fire, eating and relaxing. The light from the flames flickered against the trees, creating shifting shadows. My wife's stepbrother seemed a bit on edge. He kept looking around, scanning the dark beyond the firelight. I figured he was just tired. Eventually, we put the fire out and went to our tents. The night was cold, but I managed to fall asleep quickly. Then I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. I could hear my wife's breathing beside me, steady, calm, but something felt off. I listened carefully. Then I heard it, a sound, faint somewhere beyond our camp. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't an animal. It was too precise, too human. The steps crunched against the forest floor, moving closer, then stopping. Whoever it was, they were watching us. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. I could hear my wife's stepbrother shifting in his tent. He had heard it too. Then the footsteps started again, circling, moving just outside our camp. I strained my eyes in the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The fire was out, and the moon barely provided any light through the thick trees. Minutes passed, then an hour. The footsteps stopped, but I didn't sleep after that. By morning, it was like nothing had happened. The forest was alive again, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. My wife didn't notice anything wrong, but her stepbrother and I exchanged a look. We didn't say anything, but we both knew something had been there. We packed up quickly, deciding to cut the trip short. Something felt wrong about this place. We didn't want to stay another night. The hike back started normal. We moved fast, wanting to get back to the car as soon as possible. But after a few hours, my wife's stepbrother stopped suddenly. He pointed at the ground. Footprints, not ours, fresh, leading from the direction we had camped. Someone had been following us. We didn't stop after that. We moved as fast as we could without running, our eyes scanning the trees, listening for any sound. The further we got from our campsite, the more it felt like we were being watched. By the time we reached the car, we were exhausted, but we didn't feel safe yet. We got in, locked the doors, and drove away. It wasn't until we were miles down the road that my wife's stepbrother finally spoke. "There was someone out there last night," he said. I didn't argue. I knew he was right. We never figured out who it was or what they wanted. But the thought of someone out there, in the middle of nowhere, watching us, staying just out of sight, that was enough. We never went back. I was never one to worry much about the outdoors. I had been hiking for years, mostly alone, and I liked the quiet. There was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise of daily life, that made everything feel right. I never saw it as dangerous. Sure, I carried the right gear, a knife, a first aid kit, enough food and water, but that was just being smart. I had always believed that if you respected nature, it would respect you back. That belief was wrong. I had planned a long hike in a remote area, deep in the mountains. It wasn't my first time out there, and I had a good understanding of the terrain. The trail wasn't popular, which was why I liked it. No people, no noise, just miles of trees, rocky paths, and the occasional wildlife sighting. The hike was meant to last 3 days, a loop that would bring me back to my truck on the third morning. The first day was uneventful. The air was cool, the sky was clear, and I made good progress. I set up camp near a small creek, cooked a meal, and got some rest. The only sound that night was the wind moving through the trees. The second day, I got up early and continued on. I hiked for hours, stopping only for water and a quick meal. The farther I went, the more rugged the landscape became. The trees thinned out in some areas, giving way to open stretches of land covered in tall grass and scattered rocks. Eventually, I reached a dense forest where the trees blocked out most of the sunlight. That was where things started to feel different. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a feeling small at first, like I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing, that I had been alone for almost 2 days and my mind was looking for something to focus on. I kept moving, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I started noticing little things, twigs snapping in the distance, the way the birds would suddenly go quiet. At one point, I turned around, certain I had heard something behind me, but there was nothing there, just trees and silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear, but I knew better. I had spent years hiking and camping. I knew what it felt like when an animal was nearby. This wasn't that. I kept moving, trying to ignore the growing unease. By late afternoon, I reached the area where I had planned to camp for the night. It was a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees, with just enough space to set up my tent. I was exhausted, but something about the place felt wrong. The ground was disturbed, the way it would be if something had moved through recently. Not an animal, something bigger. Still, I forced myself to set up camp. I built a fire, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my gut. The night was colder than the one before. The fire gave off enough warmth, but I felt exposed sitting there. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see something staring back at me. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. Not an animal, not the wind, something moving through the trees, steady and deliberate. Not fast, not slow, just moving. I grabbed my knife and turned toward the sound, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there. I could feel it. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening. The sound stopped. Silence. Too much silence. The kind that only happens when something is nearby. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, listening, waiting. Nothing else happened, but the feeling never went away. The first light, I packed up and started moving. I had planned to spend another day out there, but I decided to cut the trip short. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. As I moved through the trees, I kept checking behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, about an hour into my hike, I saw something. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones, heading in the same direction I was going. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal tracks. They were barefoot. Large, human, but off. The toes were long, the shape strange. I crouched down, staring at them, my stomach twisting. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone had been out here during the night. I stood up and kept moving, faster this time. My plan was simple: get back to my truck as quickly as possible. The forest felt different now. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every sound made my skin crawl. The path ahead felt longer than it should have. The trees felt closer. The air felt heavier. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my breath catch. A tree. A tall pine, stripped of its bark. Not cut, not scratched, peeled. Long strips of bark had been torn away, leaving pale wood underneath. It wasn't natural. Something had done it. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. That was when I saw what was on the wood. Marks. Deep, jagged scratches running down the length of the tree. Claw marks. No animal I knew left marks like that. The spacing was off, the pattern too deliberate. I ran my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh. I stepped back, gripping my knife, and turned to keep moving. And that was when I saw it. A shape, deep in the trees, just on the edge of my vision. Tall, too tall, not moving, watching. My body locked up. My breathing stopped. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The trees blurred past me. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't stop for anything. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would explode. When I finally saw my truck, I almost collapsed from relief. I fumbled with the keys, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the engine started. As I pulled onto the road, I finally looked in the rearview mirror. The tree line was empty, but I knew without a doubt that something had been out there. Something had followed me, and it had let me go. Hiking was something I did often. It was never about pushing limits or breaking records, just the quiet, the fresh air, and the feeling of being away from everything. I liked the isolation, the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt, and the way the world seemed simpler when I was deep in the woods. I had done this trail before, nothing technical, just a long stretch of wilderness cutting through the mountains. It had been raining earlier in the week, and the dirt was still soft in places. Patches of mud clung to my boots, and the scent of wet earth was thick in the air. I had packed light, a small backpack with some food, a water bottle, and a knife. Nothing I wasn't used to carrying. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The trees were dense, their branches reaching overhead, forming a natural tunnel. Birds chirped in the distance, and every now and then, I caught the sound of running water. The trail was empty, no other hikers. That was common this time of year. Most people didn't like being alone out here. I didn't think much about it until I noticed something strange. The first sign was the footprints. They were deep, pressed hard into the damp soil, and going in the same direction as me. At first, I ignored them. It wasn't weird to see other hikers' footprints, but these were erratic. Some pressed deep into the mud like someone had been stumbling, others more spaced apart as if they had been running. There were no returning prints. Whoever made them hadn't come back this way. I kept moving. An hour passed, and the sky was shifting. The sun hung lower, dipping behind the trees. The trail curved along a ridge, and from up there, I could see the valley below, thick with trees, the distant glint of a river cutting through it. It was beautiful, but something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched. I shook it off, just my mind playing tricks. But then the smell hit me. Rot. It was faint at first, mixed in with the damp forest air. But as I kept walking, it got stronger, until it was impossible to ignore. Something was dead nearby. I scanned the trail ahead, looking for roadkill, maybe a deer that had wandered too close to a predator. But there was nothing on the path. The smell was coming from the trees. I don't know why I stepped off the trail. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe something deeper, something in my gut telling me I was about to find something I wasn't supposed to. The ground was soft, my boots sinking slightly with every step. The trees were close together here, their trunks covered in moss. I moved slowly, brushing past branches, my heart thudding a little harder now. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of clothes, dark, soaked through with mud and leaves. But then my eyes adjusted, and I realized what I was looking at. A body, face down in the dirt, arms bent awkwardly at the sides, legs half buried in the undergrowth. The clothes were torn, and the skin that was visible was pale, too pale. The smell was worse now, thick and sour, clinging to the air. I stood there for a long time. It didn't move. I don't know how long it had been there, but the way the body was positioned, the way the leaves had started to gather around it, made it clear it hadn't been long. Days, maybe, not weeks. My first thought was to check if they were alive, but I knew before I even took a step that they weren't. The air was too still. There was no rise and fall of breathing, no twitch of movement. I stepped closer anyway. The ground made a wet sound beneath my boots. I crouched down, careful not to touch the body, and looked at the details. The clothes were hiking gear, expensive stuff. A jacket that had once been a bright color but was now stained with mud. Boots that looked brand new. Then I saw the wounds. Deep gashes along the back, cutting through fabric and into flesh. Not the kind of wounds you'd get from falling. Not from an animal either, at least not one I could think of. Something wasn't right. I looked around, scanning the trees, listening. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. The birds had stopped. The wind barely moved. I needed to leave. I stood up, backing away from the body, my mind racing. This wasn't an accident. Someone did this. And if they had done it recently, they might still be out here. I turned back toward the trail, moving fast. My boots crunched against the dirt, and with every step, I felt like I was being watched. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The trees blurred together as I pushed forward. Then I saw something ahead on the trail. More footprints. They hadn't been there before. Fresh ones, leading away from where I had just come from. Someone else was out here. I kept moving faster now. My breathing was heavy, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Every sound felt too loud. My boots, my breath, the rustling of my jacket. I glanced over my shoulder every few steps, but I never saw anything. Just trees. just shadows. It felt like it took forever, but I finally made it back to the spot where the trail split. One way led back the way I had come, back to my car. The other led deeper into the mountains. I didn't hesitate. I took the path back. The sun was almost gone now, the trees stretching long shadows across the trail. I kept moving, forcing myself not to run. Running made noise. Running made mistakes. I just needed to get back to my car. Then I heard it, a branch snapping behind me. I didn't stop. Another sound. Closer. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace, my legs burning, my lungs tight. The trail felt longer than before. The trees felt closer. And then, finally, I saw it, the small clearing where I had parked. My car was still there. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my keys. My hands were shaking. I glanced back one last time. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trailhead. Empty. I didn't stay to think. I put the car in reverse, turned around, and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until I saw streetlights, until I felt like I was back in the real world. I reported what I found, told the police everything. They went out there the next morning. The body was gone, just like that. No sign of it.
No footprints.
Nothing. But I know what I saw. I never went back to that trail. It was late September when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip. The kind of trip that clears your head, gives you space to think, and lets you disconnect from the constant hum of modern life. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, and I wasn't worried about being alone in the woods. If anything, I preferred it that way.
No distractions. No responsibilities.
Just me, the trees, and the sound of my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. I had picked a trail that wasn't well known but wasn't completely remote either. It was about a 3-hour drive from where I lived, tucked away in the mountains. The hike itself was a loop that stretched for nearly 15 miles, winding through thick forests, rocky inclines, and small clearings that overlooked valleys below. There were a few campsites along the way, and my plan was to complete the trail in 2 days, hike half, set up camp for the night, and finish the loop the next morning. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon. The sky was overcast, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and pine. I strapped on my pack, checked my gear one last time, and set off. The trail started off easy, just a gentle incline with a well-marked path. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. Every so often, I would stop to take in the quiet, letting my mind wander. About 2 hours in, the trail got steeper. The trees grew denser, the air heavier. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, where even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. I didn't mind. I liked that kind of silence. It made the world feel smaller, more personal. Then I saw her. She was standing on the side of the trail, just ahead of me, partially obscured by the trees. At first, I thought she was just another hiker, maybe someone taking a break or waiting for a companion to catch up. She was wearing a long, dark coat, something heavy, the kind of thing you'd wear in winter rather than early fall. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, like she was standing too straight, too still. I slowed my pace, watching her carefully. She wasn't moving, just standing there, not adjusting her pack, not drinking water, just standing. Something about her made my skin crawl. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. Her face was pale, her eyes dark. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging in uneven strands over her face. She wasn't looking at me, but she wasn't looking away either. It was like she was staring past me, through me. I debated whether to say something. A quick nod, a polite acknowledgement. but something deep in my gut told me to just keep walking. So I did. I kept my pace steady, moving past her without looking directly at her. I could feel her presence, though, like the weight of a storm cloud pressing down on my shoulders. Once I was a few yards ahead, I glanced back. She was still there, still standing in the same spot, still facing forward. I picked up my pace. For the next hour, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow felt like it was her. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me. But she wasn't there. By the time I reached the halfway point of my hike, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. I found a small clearing near a stream and decided it was as good a place as any to set up camp. I went through my usual routine, pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and heated up a quick meal. As the night settled in, I tried to push the memory of the woman out of my mind. She was probably just another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost or was waiting for someone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt different that night. The usual sounds of nocturnal life, the chirping of insects, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush were absent. The silence was too deep, too heavy. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was just outside my tent, watching me. A few times, I thought I heard movement, soft footsteps, the crunch of leaves. But when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light crept through the trees, I broke camp and got back on the trail. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the lack of sleep had messed with my head. I just needed to finish the hike, get back to my car, and put this whole thing behind me. I was about an hour into my hike when I saw her again. She was ahead of me on the trail, standing in the exact same way as before. Stiff, unmoving, her face partially hidden by her hair. My stomach turned to ice. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. I had been hiking since dawn, and I hadn't seen another soul on the trail. If she had passed me in the night, I would have heard her. There was no shortcut she could have taken to get ahead of me. She shouldn't be there. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept walking, keeping my eyes locked forward, pretending she wasn't there. As I passed her, I noticed something else. Her clothes, her coat, her boots were damp, covered in mud, as if she had been walking through the forest all night. But her face, her hands, completely clean. I moved faster. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. I could feel her eyes on me. The last few miles of the trail were a blur. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The only thing that mattered was getting back to my car. By the time I reached the trailhead, my hands were shaking so badly I struggled to unlock my car door. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped in, and started the engine. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The trail was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never told anyone what happened. Never wrote about it, never looked up missing persons reports, never went back to that trail. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods, I get that feeling again. The feeling of being watched. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting. It was early September when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the mountains. I had been wanting to test myself, to see if I could handle a few days out in the wilderness alone, away from the noise of life. I picked a remote trail in Colorado, a place where I knew I wouldn't run into many people. The idea was to disconnect, to push myself, to get away from everything for a while. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 4 hours, winding through dense forests and steep inclines. The road eventually turned to dirt, and I had to go slow to avoid tearing up my car on the rough terrain. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to sink lower in the sky. I had planned to get there earlier, but the drive took longer than expected. Still, I wasn't too worried. I had mapped everything out in advance. The first leg of my hike was only about 6 miles to a good camping spot near a small lake. I figured I could make it before full dark if I moved quickly. I strapped on my backpack, adjusted my gear, and started down the trail. The air was crisp, with a slight chill that hinted at the coming fall. The smell of pine needles and damp earth filled my lungs as I made my way deeper into the woods. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustling of branches as squirrels darted around above me. The first couple of miles were peaceful. I found myself settling into a rhythm, my breathing steady, my mind clearing. Every so often, I would stop to take in the view. Towering pines stretching up into the sky, the occasional break in the trees revealing distant mountain peaks bathed in golden light. It was everything I had hoped for. About an hour in, I started to feel like something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense that the woods around me had grown too quiet. The usual background noise of birds chirping and insects buzzing had faded. Even the wind, which had been rustling the treetops when I started, had died down. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. I pushed the thought aside and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I started noticing little things. A set of deep scratches on a tree trunk, higher up than any bear or mountain lion would have made. A few broken branches along the trail that didn't look like they had fallen naturally. At one point, I spotted a deer carcass just off the path. It was fresh, the body mostly intact, but the eyes were missing. Something about it made my skin crawl. I had seen dead animals in the wild before, but there was something strange about this one. I picked up my pace, wanting to reach my campsite before dark. The last thing I needed was to be stuck in unfamiliar terrain at night. By the time I made it to the lake, the sun had almost completely set. I quickly set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up again, rustling through the trees around me. As I sat by the fire, I kept getting the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me after seeing that deer. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it, a whistle. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, high-pitched and clear. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but then it came again. A little closer this time. It wasn't a bird or any animal I knew. It sounded human, but there was something wrong with it. It was too perfect, too deliberate, like someone was mimicking a whistle rather than actually whistling. I stood up, my body tense. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the fire. My instincts screamed at me to put the fire out, to get inside the tent, to stay quiet. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. The whistling stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, my ears straining for any sound. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down. I kept my knife close, my flashlight within reach. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving in the woods, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but I couldn't be sure. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear a faint rustling outside my tent. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the thin fabric, but when I looked out, there was nothing there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and got moving. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The second day was worse. The deeper I went into the forest, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. The feeling of unease from the previous night hadn't faded. It had grown stronger. Around midday, I came across another dead animal. This time, it was a fox, its body twisted unnaturally, its eyes missing just like the deer. The fur along its back was matted with dried blood, but there were no visible wounds. It looked like it had been dropped there, placed in the middle of the trail. I felt my stomach twist. Something was wrong. I should have turned back. I should have cut my trip short, but I was too stubborn. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I kept going. That night, I didn't make a fire. I set up my tent deep in the trees, away from the open, trying to stay hidden. As the sun went down, the forest grew unnervingly quiet again. Then, just as before, the whistling started. This time, it was closer. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My knife was gripped tightly in my hand. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Not an animal, something walking on two legs. They circled my tent. Once, twice. I didn't move. Then, right outside my tent, I heard a voice. Sounded like my own. It whispered my name. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out from fear because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining through the trees. My body was shaking. I forced myself to pack up and started moving as fast as I could. I didn't stop. I hiked for hours, pushing myself beyond exhaustion. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just kept moving. By the time I reached my car, my legs were nearly giving out. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from that place. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never go hiking alone again.